The humidity in Mountain Brook always had a way of clinging to you, but that Tuesday morning in late September, it felt like a lead weight pressing against my lungs. I was 64 years old, and for the last decade, my morning walk through the winding, oak-shaded streets of our Alabama suburb was the only thing keeping my joints from seizing up and my mind from drifting too far into the past. I liked the rhythm of it, the rhythmic thud of my sneakers on the pavement, the familiar whistle of the cardinal that lived in the hedges near the cul-de-sac, and the quiet pride of returning to the house I'd spent 30 years paying for. It was a sprawling colonial on Crestline Drive, a place of white brick and dark ivy, the kind of house that whispered about stability and hard-earned success. I'd spent my career in high-stakes insurance litigation, a world of fine print and cold calculations. I knew how to spot a liability from a mile away. But as I rounded the final corner of my street, I realized I'd been blind to the biggest liability of all, and it was currently parked in my driveway. A massive, soot-covered moving truck from a cut-rate rental company was idling right in front of my garage, its engine rattling like a jar of rusted nails. It looked like a scar on the face of the neighborhood. Two men in stained t-shirts were hauling a heavy plastic-wrapped armoire up my front steps, dragging the base across the slate tile I'd had imported from Italy 5 years ago. My pulse didn't just quicken, it spiked. This wasn't a delivery. This was an invasion. I didn't run, my knees wouldn't allow it, but I reached the porch just as the front door swung wide. My son, Julian, stood there. He looked smaller than usual, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting toward the street rather than meeting mine. Julian was 32, a man who had never quite found his footing in the world of finance, so I'd let him and his wife move into the west wing of the house 2 years ago. I thought I was being a good father. I thought I was building a bridge. "Julian, what the hell is this?" I asked, my voice tight but controlled. I pointed a trembling finger at the truck. "Who is moving furniture into my house at 8 in the morning?" Before Julian could find his voice, a woman stepped out from behind him. Cassandra, his wife, was a woman who navigated life with the sharp, predatory grace of someone who always knew where the exits were. She was holding a clipboard, of all things, as if she were the foreman of a construction site. She didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed that I was interrupting the flow. "Oh, Arthur, you're back early," she said, her voice dripping with that rehearsed southern sweetness that actually tastes like vinegar. "We didn't expect you for another 20 minutes. Julian, help the men with the vanity. It needs to go upstairs immediately." "Wait a minute." I stepped into the foyer, my boots tracking grit onto the hardwood. "Nobody is taking anything upstairs until someone tells me what's going on." "Julian?" My son finally looked at me, but there was no strength in his gaze. "Dad, look, Vance and Eleanor had a situation. A legal thing with their property in Florida. They had to vacate by Monday. They didn't have anywhere to go, and I couldn't just let them stay in some budget motel. Not with Eleanor's nerves. Vance and Eleanor Blackwood. Cassandra's parents. I'd met them exactly 3 times at the wedding, and at 2 disastrous Christmas dinners. Vance was a man who smelled of expensive gin and cheap excuses, a consultant whose primary business seemed to be losing other people's money. Eleanor was a woman who treated life like a stage play where she was the only one who had studied the script. "They're moving in?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Without a phone call? Without a conversation? This is my home, Julian." "This isn't a boarding house. It's just for a few months, Arthur," Cassandra interrupted, stepping between me and my son. She placed a hand on my arm, a gesture that felt more like a restraint than a comfort. "We're all family here. And honestly, this house is far too big for one man. You've been rattling around in here like a ghost since Sarah passed. We thought this would be good for you. Some life in the house." The mention of my late wife, Sarah, felt like a slap. Sarah had loved this house. Every piece of molding, every light fixture had been her choice. To suggest that these people, these grifters, were life in her house was an insult I couldn't swallow. I pushed past them into the living room, and my heart nearly stopped. Even space was unrecognizable. My hand-tufted Persian rug had been rolled up and shoved into a corner like a piece of trash. In its place was a hideous, oversized sectional sofa in a shade of aggressive beige. Boxes were stacked high against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blocking the view of the garden Sarah had spent decades cultivating. And there, sitting in my leather wingback chair, the one I'd bought with my first major partner bonus 30 years ago, was Vance Blackwood. He was wearing a silk robe that looked like it belonged in a 1970s casino, a glass of my 20-year-old scotch already in his hand. At 9 in the morning. He didn't even stand up when I walked in. He just raised the glass in a mock toast, a smirk playing on his thin, sharp lips. "Sterling," he drawled, using my last name like we were old rivals on the golf course. "Nice place you've got here. A bit dusty in the corners, but we'll fix that. Eleanor is already talking to a decorator about the drapes. Those heavy velvet things have to go. They're depressing." "Get out of my chair, Vance," I said, the words coming out as a low growl. Now, Arthur." Eleanor's voice floated from the kitchen. She appeared in the doorway, clutching a stack of my fine china, the stuff Sarah only brought out for anniversaries. "Let's not be territorial. We're in a transition period. We all need to be flexible. And honestly, this chair is the only thing in this room that doesn't smell like a library. We're going to need to update the HVAC too. It's far too humid in here for my sinuses." I turned back to Julian, who was hovering in the foyer looking like he wanted to vanish into the drywall. "Julian, tell them this isn't happening. I gave you a place to stay because you were struggling. I didn't give you the right to invite the entire Blackwood clan to strip mine my life." Julian opened his mouth, but Cassandra was faster. She stepped up to him, her hand gripping his shoulder with a firm, possessive strength. "Julian and I have discussed this, Arthur. We're the ones who are going to be taking care of you as you get older. We're the ones keeping this house running. If we're going to be a family unit, we need to make decisions that benefit everyone. My parents are here to help. Vance is a brilliant businessman. He can help you manage your estate. You're retired now. You should be relaxing, not worrying about property lines." The air in the room felt suffocating. I looked from Vance, lounging in my chair, to Eleanor, dismissing my wife's taste, to my own son, who couldn't even look me in the eye. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I had spent my life building a fortress, and I'd left the gate wide open for the people I loved, only to find they'd brought a Trojan horse with them. "I'm going to my office," I said, my voice shaking. "I need to think." "Oh, about that," Cassandra said, her voice airy, as if she were mentioning a change in the weather. "We've already moved your desk into the basement. Eleanor needs a sunroom for her yoga, and your office has the best morning light. We figured since you're not practicing law anymore, you wouldn't mind. The basement is much quieter anyway. More suited for someone your age." I stood frozen. My office was my sanctuary. It held my library, my files, my memories. They hadn't just moved in. They were erasing me, inch by inch, from the top down. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the first hour of a long, calculated siege. What happened next would change the trajectory of my life and force me to become the very thing I'd spent 40 years litigating against, a man with nothing left to lose. I looked at the stairs, then at the moving truck still unloading boxes of Blackwood junk onto my lawn. A dark, cold clarity began to settle over me. They thought I was a tired old man. They thought my silence was submission. They were about to learn that you never, ever try to outmaneuver an insurance lawyer in his own home. But as I turned to head toward the basement, Vance called out from the living room, his voice loud and mocking. "And Sterling? Don't bother going to the master suite tonight. Eleanor and I are already settled in there. The guest wing is far too drafty for us. You can take the pull-out couch in the basement office. It'll be like a little adventure for you." I stopped at the top of the basement stairs, my hand gripping the railing until my knuckles turned white. The betrayal was complete. I was officially a guest in my own house, and the clock on my revenge had just started ticking. The stairs to the basement didn't just lead to a lower floor. They felt like the descent into a tomb I hadn't realized I'd spent 40 years digging. The air down here was different, cooler, certainly, but it carried the scent of cedar blocks and the faint, metallic tang of the old furnace. My office, which had once been a bastion of cherry wood and leather-bound law journals on the second floor, was now a chaotic heap of boxes in a windowless room next to the laundry area. I sat on the edge of the pull-out sofa. The springs groaned, a metallic protest against my weight, sounding far more tired than I felt. I looked at my desk, my mahogany fortress, now shoved against a cinder block wall. They hadn't even bothered to unpack the lamps. I was sitting in the dark, illuminated only by the flickering fluorescent light from the hallway. I thought about Sarah. If she were here, she would have burned the house down before letting Eleanor Blackwood touch her china. Sarah was the steel in our family's spine. When she died 4 years ago, I think Julian lost his compass, and I lost my reason to fight. That was my first mistake. I had become soft in my grief, mistaking Julian's sudden interest in staying close for filial piety, when it was actually a calculated land grab orchestrated by the woman he'd married. I remembered the first time Julian brought Cassandra to the house. It was 6 months after Sarah's funeral. She had walked through the foyer, her eyes not on the photos of our family, but on the crown molding and the height of the ceilings. She hadn't seen a home. She'd seen an asset. I'd ignored the warning signs because I was lonely. I'd ignored the way she slowly replaced the family recipes with organic meal kits, the way she pruned Sarah's rose garden until it was a barren patch of mulch. I let it happen because I wanted my son to be happy. I wanted the house to feel full again. What a fool I had been. The sound of laughter drifted down the vents, sharp, piercing, and entirely too comfortable. It was Vance. He had a booming, performative laugh that always felt like he was trying to sell you something. I looked up at the ceiling, watching the faint vibration of the floorboards as they walked over my head. My house. My life. They were literally treading on me. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours cataloging the sounds from above. The heavy, arrogant tread of Vance. The light, clicking heels of Cassandra. The silence of Julian. That was the most painful part, the silence of my own blood. By morning, the transition had shifted into a full-scale occupation. I went upstairs at 7, hoping for a quiet cup of coffee, only to find the kitchen transformed into a war zone of high-end appliances I didn't own and gourmet ingredients that smelled of arrogance. Eleanor was there, wearing a silk turban and a look of pure disdain. She was throwing away the contents of my pantry. "Arthur, honestly," she said, holding up a jar of the local honey I'd bought at the farmer's market for years. "The sugar content in this is appalling. We've brought our own supply. And I've rearranged the cabinets. It was all so illogical before. I couldn't find the turmeric to save my life." "That honey was from a friend's farm, Eleanor," I said, my voice sounding raspy even to my own ears. "Put it back. It's already in the bin, dear. Germs, you know. Once things are open, they're practically biohazards." She turned back to her task, dismissing me as if I were a gardener she'd forgotten to pay. I looked toward the breakfast nook. Vance was sitting there, reading my morning paper, the one I paid for, and eating the breakfast Cassandra had prepared for him. Julian was nowhere to be seen. Probably hiding in his room, or perhaps he'd already retreated to his office at the firm where he was perpetually on the verge of a big break. "Morning, Sterling," Vance grunted, not looking up from the business section. "I saw your portfolio on the desk in the basement when I was looking for a stapler. You're a bit heavy on bonds, don't you think? In this market, you're practically bleeding money. We should sit down. I've got some ventures in the Caribbean that are looking for institutional-grade seed funding. High yield, low exposure. You were in my office, Vance?" I stepped closer, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "You went through my private files? Our office now, isn't it?" He finally looked up, his eyes cold and predatory. "And besides, you're retired. What secrets could you possibly be keeping? Your golf handicap? We're all family now, Arthur. Transparency is the key to a healthy home." The arrogance of it was a physical weight. I realized then that they weren't just staying here because of a legal thing in Florida. They were here because they had run out of people to grift, and I was the biggest mark left on their map. I retreated to the basement, but not to hide. I opened my laptop and began to do what I did best. I started a file. I didn't know it yet, but the next 3 days would be the most humiliating of my life. On Wednesday, they changed the code on the security system. I came home from a walk to find the alarm blaring and Cassandra looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance as she reset it. "We had to update it for the new insurance policy, Arthur," she lied, her eyes never meeting mine. "I'll give you the new code later. For now, just knock. It's better that way. We don't want to startle Mom." On Thursday, my car was moved to the street. A leak in the garage, they claimed, though the floor was bone dry. Vance's oversized SUV now sat in my spot, leaking oil onto the pristine concrete. But the breaking point came on Friday night. They had decided to host a welcome to the neighborhood dinner. They hadn't invited any of my friends, the people I'd known for 30 years. Instead, they had invited the Sterling Harrisons and the Montgomerys, the old money power players of Mountain Brook who I usually only saw at charity galas. I wasn't invited to the table. "Arthur, honey," Cassandra said, appearing in the basement doorway around 6. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage. "One having some very important people over tonight, business associates of Vance's. It's a very tight table, and honestly, the conversation might be a bit technical. We've left a lovely salad and some cold chicken for you in the basement fridge. It's probably better if you stay down here. You know how you get tired in the evenings. You're entertaining guests in my dining room, and I'm expected to hide in the cellar?" I asked. I felt a strange, cold laugh bubbling up in my chest. "It's for the best, Dad," Julian said, appearing behind her. He looked pained, but he didn't move to help me. "Vance is trying to close a deal. It could change everything for us, for the whole family. Just, please, don't make a scene." I watched them turn and walk away. I stood there, in the dim light of the basement, listening to the sounds of crystal clinking and the smell of roasting lamb wafting through the vents. The humiliation was so complete, it had become a sort of liberation. I sat at my desk and pulled up a chair. I didn't eat the cold chicken. I began to work. I accessed the public records for Palm Beach County. I looked for Vance Blackwood. I looked for Vance Blackwood Consulting. I looked for Blackwood Estate Holdings. What I found was a trail of wreckage that made my blood run cold. Bankruptcies, unresolved civil suits, and a very specific restraining order filed by a former business partner. But there was something else, something smaller, buried in the fine print of a tax lien. Vance and Eleanor hadn't vacated their property in Florida because of a legal misunderstanding. They had lost it to the state because of a massive, unpaid debt to a private creditor, a creditor that didn't use lawyers to settle their scores. And then, I heard it. The air vent in the basement office was connected directly to the master suite, my old bedroom. Because the house was old, the acoustics were perfect. I heard the door click shut. I heard the rustle of silk. And then I heard Vance's voice, no longer booming and jovial, but sharp and desperate. "We have to move faster, Cassandra," Vance hissed. "The people from the Florida firm aren't going to wait another month. They know I'm in Alabama." "I'm working on it, Dad," Cassandra's voice replied. It was cold, colder than I'd ever heard it. "Julian is almost there. I've convinced him that Arthur is starting to show signs of cognitive decline. We just need to get the power of attorney signed. Once I have that, I can transfer the deed to the trust. Arthur won't even know what happened until he's in the assisted living facility." "And the money?" Eleanor's voice joined in. "The Sterling pension? The litigation settlement funds?" "All of it," Cassandra said. "Julian thinks we're doing it to protect the estate from Arthur's bad investments. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him. By Christmas, this house will be ours and Arthur will be a memory." I sat in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. They weren't just staying, they weren't just annoying. They were predators, and they were already closing the jaws of the trap. But as I looked at the screen of my laptop, seeing the name of the man Vance owed money to in Florida, a man I happened to have successfully defended in a massive racketeering case 10 years ago, I realized they had made one fatal error. They thought I was the prey. They didn't know that in the world of insurance litigation, we don't just find the fire, we find the person who lit the match. And I was about to set their entire world ablaze. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade. It was a Saturday night, but I knew he would answer. "Hello?" A gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "Silas?" I said, my voice steady, the lawyer in me finally waking up from a 4-year slumber. "This is Arthur Sterling. I believe you've been looking for a man named Vance Blackwood. I happen to know exactly where he's sleeping tonight, in my bed." The silence on the other end was heavy with promise. "I'll be in touch, Silas," I whispered, glancing up at the ceiling as the laughter from the dinner party grew louder. "But first, I have a few things to move out of the way. I wouldn't want any of my nice things to get damaged in the crossfire." I hung up and looked at the boxes around me. I didn't feel tired anymore. I didn't feel old. I felt like a man who was about to show his family exactly what happens when you try to bury a lion while he's still got his teeth. The silence that followed my call to Silas was heavier than the darkness in the basement. I sat there for a long time, the blue light of the laptop screen etching lines into my face. I'd spent my life as a man of the law, a man who believed in the structural integrity of the system. Calling Silas a man who operated in the shadows where the law couldn't reach felt like breaking a fundamental part of myself. But as I listened to the muffled sounds of the Blackwoods laughing in my master suite above, I realized that the man I used to be was already dead to them. To them, I was just a walking insurance policy, a bank account with a heartbeat. I didn't know it yet, but the psychological warfare was only just beginning. Monday morning arrived with a deceptive calm. I climbed the stairs at 7 a.m., my back aching from the pull-out sofa, and went straight for the kitchen. I needed my keys. I had a meeting with a private investigator I'd scouted online, someone to tail Vance and document his movements. I reached for the small brass hook near the pantry where my keys had hung for 15 years. The hook was empty. "Looking for these, Arthur?" Cassandra asked. She was leaning against the marble island, sipping a green smoothie. She held my keychain up by the ring, dangling it like a piece of bait. "I have an appointment, Cassandra. Give me my keys." She didn't move. Instead, her face shifted into that look of practiced, heartbreaking concern, the kind of look you give a toddler who's insisted he can fly. "Arthur, we talked about this last night. Don't you remember?" "We didn't talk about anything last night. I was in the basement." "Oh dear," she sighed, glancing over her shoulder at Eleanor, who was busy alphabetizing my spice rack. "You came up around 10. You were very agitated. You said you were worried about the shadow people in the driveway. We decided together that it's probably safer if Julian or I drive you for a while, just until we get your vitamin levels checked." My heart hammered against my ribs. "I never said that. I was asleep by 10. "You were in the kitchen, Arthur," Eleanor chimed in, not even turning around. "You tried to put the kettle in the refrigerator. It was very upsetting for everyone. Julian had to sit with you for an hour." It was a lie. A bold, bald-faced, terrifying lie. I looked at the refrigerator, then at the hook, then at the two women who were watching me with predatory stillness. They were testing the waters, seeing how easily they could rewrite my reality. This was the cognitive decline Cassandra had whispered about through the vent. They weren't just taking my house, they were stealing my sanity. "Julian," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Julian, get in here!" My son appeared from the hallway, his face a mask of weary disappointment. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He was holding a stack of papers, legal-sized, yellow-lined. "Dad, please, stop shouting." "You're upsetting, Mom." "She's not your mother, Julian," I snapped. "Your mother is in the ground at Oak Hill, and she'd be disgusted by what you're letting these people do." "Did I come up here last night? Did I talk about shadow people?" Julian hesitated. I saw the flicker of the boy I used to know, the one who used to follow me around the yard with a plastic lawnmower. But then he looked at Cassandra. She didn't say a word, but her grip on her smoothie glass tightened. "You were confused, Dad," Julian whispered. "You've been under a lot of stress. Retirement is a big transition. Maybe we should just let Dr. Harrison come by this afternoon, just for a chat." Dr. Sterling Harrison, one of the most prestigious geriatric specialists in the South, and a man who owed his current country club membership to a referral Vance had given him years ago. The trap was closing. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to stop shaking. I'd spent 40 years cross-examining liars. I knew that the moment you lose your temper, you lose the case. I lowered my voice. "Fine. If you think I'm confused, keep the keys. I'll just go for a walk." I turned and walked out, ignoring the triumphant smirk I knew was on Cassandra's face. I didn't go for a walk. I went back to the basement, locked the door, and pulled a hidden floor safe from under the laundry sink. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a ledger. As I flipped through the pages, the history of my son's betrayal became clear. It had started 4 years ago, right after Sarah died. Julian had come to me with a sure thing, a tech startup in Birmingham called Vanguard Logistics. He needed $200,000 for the seed round. I'd given it to him, not as a loan, but as a gift. Then came the expansion, into Nashville, another $100,000. Then the legal fees when the Nashville office folded. By the time Cassandra entered the picture, I had funneled nearly $500,000 into Julian's failing dreams. He didn't see me as a father, he saw me as a dwindling resource. Cassandra had simply been the one to realize that the resource would last longer if the owner was deemed incapable of managing it. I sat there, looking at the numbers. $542,000. That was the price of my son's loyalty. What happened next changed the tenor of the day entirely. Around 3 p.m., a black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Dr. Sterling Harrison had arrived. I stayed in the basement, listening to the chime of the doorbell and the hushed, urgent tones of Vance greeting him. "He's downstairs," I heard Vance say. "He's been down there for hours. Keeps talking to himself. It's heartbreaking, really. A man of his intellect, just fading away." I didn't wait for them to come get me. I walked up the stairs, but I didn't go into the living room. I went to the coat closet in the foyer. Earlier that morning, I'd noticed Eleanor tucking her oversized designer handbag into the corner of the closet. I reached inside, my fingers trembling as I found the side pocket. I pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was unsealed. I slipped the contents out just enough to read the header, "Preserving the Legacy. Admissions packet for the Heritage Grove Luxury Suites." My breath hitched. Heritage Grove. It was a high-security memory care facility, 2 hours away. It was a warehouse for the wealthy and unwanted. but it was the date on the cover letter that made my stomach churn. The letter was dated August 14th. The Blackwoods hadn't moved in because of a legal thing in Florida in September. They had been planning this since midsummer. They had been scouting my replacement home while I was still taking Julian and Cassandra out for Sunday brunch. "Arthur?" I jumped, shoving the envelope back into the bag and closing the closet door just as Dr. Harrison stepped into the foyer. He was a tall man with silver hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He held a leather portfolio under his arm. "Arthur, it's good to see you," Harrison said, his voice smooth and professional. "Julian tells me you've been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately. Why don't we go into your office and have a little talk?" "My office is in the basement now, doctor," I said, my voice dripping with a sarcasm I couldn't entirely hide. "But I'm sure you'd find it a bit cramped. Why don't we use the sunroom? I believe Eleanor has finished her yoga." We sat in the sunroom, the very room that used to be my sanctuary. Vance and Cassandra hovered in the doorway like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. "Arthur," Harrison began, leaning forward, "I'm going to ask you a few simple questions, just to get a baseline. Can you tell me today's date?" I told him. I told him the year, the president, and the current prime rate. I was perfect. I was precise. I saw Cassandra's jaw tighten. "Excellent," Harrison said. "Now, I want you to remember 3 words for me. Apple, table, penny. We'll come back to those in a few minutes." He continued the exam, his questions becoming more abstract. He asked me to draw a clock face. He asked me to subtract 7 from 100, repeatedly. I nailed every single one. I could feel the tension in the room shifting. They had expected me to be rattled, but I was in deposition mode. I was untouchable. Until the final question. "Arthur," Harrison said, looking at his notes, "Julian mentioned that you've been having some trouble with financial reality. He says you've been insisting that you still own a secondary property in Mobile, but that property was sold in 2019. Do you remember selling the Mobile cottage, Arthur?" I froze. I never owned a property in Mobile. My family's cottage was in Gulf Shores and we'd sold it in 2012. I don't own a place in Mobile, doctor," I said slowly. "See?" Vance whispered loudly from the doorway. "He's denying it again. He was crying about it this morning, saying he wanted to go home to the Mobile house." "I never said that." I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Arthur, please," Dr. Harrison said, his voice remaining calm, which only made me angrier. "Agitation is a common symptom. Let's try those 3 words again. Can you repeat them for me?" My mind went blank. The anger, the pure, white-hot injustice of the lie Vance had just told, had wiped my short-term memory clean. I knew they started with A, T, and P, but the words were gone. I forgot them. I whispered, the weight of the moment crashing down on me. Harrison sighed and made a deliberate mark on his chart. "It's all right, Arthur. It happens. Why don't we step outside and let me talk to Julian and Cassandra for a moment?" I walked back to the basement, my legs feeling like lead. I had lost. Even if I was sane, they were building a narrative that I wasn't, and they were using my own reactions as evidence. I sat back down at the desk in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't have time for that. I opened my laptop and checked my email. There was one new message. It was from an encrypted address. No subject line. "The Florida firm is in Birmingham. They're looking for the principal. They'll be at the Crestline address by Wednesday. Do you want me to intercept or let them through? S." I stared at the screen. Wednesday. That was 48 hours away. If I let the creditors from Florida show up, the house would become a crime scene. Vance would be gone, one way or another. But Julian and Cassandra would still be here, and they'd likely use the attack on the house as further proof that I was unable to keep the family safe. I needed a bigger play. I needed to move the pieces so that they didn't just lose the house, they lost the ability to ever touch me again. I began to type a reply to Silas. "Let them through, but tell them Vance is keeping the assets in a safe in the basement. I'll make sure the back door is unlocked at midnight on Wednesday. And Silas? Send me the contact info for that journalist you know at the Alabama Inquirer, the one who covers the old money scandals." I hit send. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to give the Blackwoods exactly what they wanted. I was going to give them a confused old man who didn't know how to lock the doors. Tuesday morning didn't arrive with the usual chirping of birds or the soft glow of the Alabama sun. It arrived with the sound of packing tape, that sharp, rhythmic screech that sounds like someone is tearing the very fabric of your life apart. I stayed in the basement, listening. I didn't need to go upstairs to know what was happening. They were clearing out the clutter. In the world of the Blackwoods, clutter was anything that didn't have a high resale value or fit the aesthetic of a luxury sunroom. I sat on the edge of the pull-out sofa, my hands clasped between my knees, and felt the house vibrating as heavy objects were dragged across the floors. I had always thought that a man's home was his castle, but I was learning that without a loyal guard, a castle is just a fancy cage. I didn't know it then, but the next few hours would test my resolve more than any 30-day trial I'd ever litigated. Around 10 a.m., the basement door creaked open. It wasn't Julian, it was Eleanor. She was wearing a pair of yellow rubber gloves and holding a stack of black industrial garbage bags. She looked around my basement office with the clinical detachment of an undertaker. "Arthur dear, we've made a start on the upstairs," she said, her voice pitched in that high, false cheerfulness. "It's so much more airy now. We thought we'd help you get organized down here too. Since you're going to be transitioning soon, you won't need all these old files." She reached for a box on top of my mahogany desk. It was a box labeled Sarah, personal. Inside were her journals, the dried flowers from our 25th anniversary, and the hand-knit baby blankets she'd kept for the grandchildren we'd always hoped Julian would give us. "Don't touch that," I said. My voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it that made Eleanor pause. "Now, Arthur, let's not be difficult. Dr. Harrison said that clinging to the past can actually accelerate the confusion. We need to create a clean, modern environment for you. We're donating most of the old linens, and these dusty trinkets." She tossed the box toward a garbage bag. It missed, spilling Sarah's life across the cold concrete floor. A framed photo of us on our honeymoon in Amalfi, the one where she was laughing so hard her sun hat had fallen off, skidded toward the sump pump. The glass shattered. I stared at the broken glass. I felt something inside me break along with it. The lawyer, the father, the grieving widower, all of those identities were suddenly stripped away, leaving only the primary instinct of a man whose sanctuary had been defiled. But I didn't yell. I didn't lung at her. I remembered the code. Don't get emotional. Get evidence. "You're right, Eleanor," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. I stood up and began to help her pick up the items, my fingers grazing the jagged glass of the photo. "I've been far too sentimental. Please, take whatever you think is best." She looked surprised, her thin eyebrows arching toward her turban. "Well, that's a much more mature attitude. I'll tell Cassandra you're being cooperative." She left a few minutes later, dragging a bag of my wife's memories behind her like she was taking out the trash. I waited until I heard the basement door click shut. Then I went to the laundry sink. I didn't wash my hands. I pulled out my phone, the burner phone I'd bought at a CVS 2 days ago, knowing Cassandra would eventually try to cut off my communication. I dialed the number Silas had given me for the journalist. "This is Arthur Sterling," I said when he answered. "I have a story for you. It's about the old money families of Mountain Brook, a rogue geriatric specialist, and a massive fraud scheme involving Florida creditors. But I need you to be at my house tomorrow night, midnight. Bring a long-range lens." "Mr. Sterling, that's a hell of a lead," the journalist, a man named Miller, replied. "But why midnight?" "Because that's when the confused old man finally loses his mind," I said and hung up. I spent the rest of the day playing the part. I wandered into the kitchen around noon, looking vacant. I let Vance lead me back to the living room and sit me in front of the television. I didn't even protest when he turned on a channel that showed nothing but looped footage of tropical fish. "There you go, Arthur," Vance said, patting me on the shoulder as if I were a golden retriever. "Just relax. Julian will be home soon. We have some papers to go over." I watched the fish. I watched their mindless, bubbling world, and in the reflection of the TV screen, I watched Vance. He was pacing the foyer, talking frantically on his cell phone. His old money veneer was cracking. His silk shirt was stained with sweat at the armpits, and he kept biting the cuticle of his thumb. "I told you, the money is here," he hissed into the phone. "The old man has a private safe. I just need another 48 hours to get the code." No, don't send anyone. I have it under control." He didn't have it under control. He was drowning, and I was the only life raft he had left, except I was a life raft made of lead. At 6 p.m., Julian and Cassandra called a family meeting in the dining room. The room was sterile now. All of Sarah's warmth had been stripped away, replaced by minimalist gray chairs and a glass table that felt like an operating slab. They sat on one side. I sat on the other. Cassandra placed a thick document in front of me. It was the power of attorney and a deed transfer for the Crestline house into a family trust, where she and Julian were the sole trustees. "Dad," Julian said, his voice thick with a fake, oily empathy. "We want what's best for you, after yesterday with Dr. Harrison. We're all worried. This document just ensures that if you have another episode, your assets are protected. You'll still live here. Of course. We'll just handle the bills and the taxes." "And the Heritage Grove luxury suites?" I asked, looking him dead in the eye. Julian flinched. He looked at Cassandra, who didn't miss a beat. "That's just an option." "Arthur," she said, her voice as sharp as a razor. "A safety net. But if you sign this now, it shows you're still capable of making sound decisions. It proves Dr. Harrison might have been wrong about the accelerated decline. It was a classic catch-22. If I didn't sign, I was too confused to understand my own interests. If I did sign, I was giving them the legal authority to commit me the next morning." I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, like a weapon. "You know, Julian," I said, swirling the pen in the air, "your mother always told me that you had a good heart, but that you were easily led. She was worried you'd end up like your grandfather, a man who let his pride outrun his pocketbook." "Dad, sign the paper," Julian said, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. "I will," I said, "but I need to be honest with you. My cognitive tests, they were a bit off because I've been worried about the basement." Vance leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with greed. "The basement?" "What about it, Arthur?" "The hidden compartment in the safe," I whispered, leaning in as if sharing a profound secret. "The one behind the false floor. There's about 80,000 in cash, and some, let's call them unregistered bearer bonds. I forgot the combination this morning. I think I'm losing it, Vance. I can't remember the last 2 digits. The air in the room changed instantly. I could practically hear the gears turning in Vance's head. $80,000. It was exactly the kind of bridge he needed to satisfy the Florida creditors for another few weeks. 80,000? Vance breathed. "Arthur, don't worry about the safe," Cassandra said, though her eyes were darting toward the basement door. "Just sign the power of attorney. We'll figure out the safe later." I signed it. I signed Arthur Sterling in big, loopy letters that looked nothing like my actual signature. I signed it with a flourish, then pushed the paper across the table. "There," I said, standing up. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I need a nap. All this family business is very draining." I walked back to the basement, but I didn't go to sleep. I checked the back door. I turned the deadbolt to the open position, but left the handle engaged so it looked locked from a distance. Then I went to the safe, the one Vance thought held his salvation. Inside the safe wasn't cash or bonds. It was a single, laminated card. It was the business card for Silas's Florida collection agency, with a handwritten note on the back. "Vance owes for the Palm Beach job. Collect in full." I placed the card in the center of the safe and left the door slightly ajar. I sat on the pull-out sofa and waited. The house grew quiet. I heard the muffled sounds of Cassandra and Julian arguing in their room. Then the sound of the master suite door closing. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate, and greedy. It was Vance. He couldn't wait. He was going to try to crack the safe while everyone was asleep. I stayed in the shadows of the laundry room, watching through the crack in the door. Vance reached the desk. He saw the safe door was ajar. He chuckled a dry, rasping sound and pulled it open. I watched his face as he realized there was no money. I watched him pick up the laminated card. Even in the dim light, I saw the moment he realized what it was. His hand began to shake. He dropped the card as if it were red hot. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He turned to run back up the stairs, but he stopped mid-step. Through the small, high window of the basement, a pair of headlights swept across the driveway. A black SUV pulled up behind the moving truck. 3 men got out. They weren't wearing uniforms, and they didn't look like they were there to move furniture. Vance saw them. He backed away from the window, his face the color of ash. He looked toward the back door, the door I had left unlocked. "Arthur," he hissed into the darkness of the basement. "Arthur, help me, they're here." I stepped out of the shadows, the burner phone in my hand, the screen glowing. I looked at the man who had tried to steal my house, my memories, and my mind. "I'm sorry, Vance," I said, my voice as cold as the concrete floor. "I'm just a confused old man. I must have forgotten to lock the back door. And I think I forgot to tell you Silas doesn't like to be kept waiting." The back door handle turned. The door swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. The back door didn't slam. It didn't bang against the wall with the dramatic flair of a movie invasion. It simply glided open, the hinges silenced by the WD-40 I'd applied under the cover of the laundry machine's spin cycle earlier that afternoon. The men who stepped into the dim light of the basement didn't look like the thugs Vance had likely dealt with in the back alleys of Miami. They were dressed in dark, tactical, casual, clean jeans, windbreakers, and the kind of heavy-soled boots that meant business. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that made the air in the basement feel suddenly very thin. Vance was backed against my mahogany desk, his fingers clawing at the edge of the wood. The silk of his robe was damp with cold sweat, and for the first time since he'd arrived in Mountain Brook, the booming, arrogant voice was gone. In its place was a high-pitched, stuttering wheeze. I have it," Vance whispered, gesturing frantically at the open safe. "The old man. He said the bonds were in there. I just need a minute to find the secondary latch." The lead man, a guy with a buzz cut and a jawline like a curbstone, didn't even look at the safe. He looked at Vance. "Silas doesn't like latches, Vance. And he definitely doesn't like being told a mark has institutional-grade seed funding when all he's got is a basement full of laundry detergent and a confused father-in-law." I stayed in the shadows of the utility room. My burner phone held steady, recording every second of the interaction. I felt a strange, detached coldness. This was the man who had sat in my wife's favorite chair and told me I was depressing. This was the man who had helped his daughter plot to lock me in a warehouse for the elderly. Watching him shrink under the gaze of real power was a form of therapy I hadn't known I needed. "Arthur," Vance screamed, his voice finally breaking. "Arthur, tell them you have the money." I stepped out of the shadows, my face a mask of wide-eyed, tremulous confusion. I let my jaw hang slightly slack, my eyes darting around the room as if I couldn't quite focus on the men standing there. It was a performance that would have won me an Oscar if there were any justice in the world. But in Mountain Brook, it was just a means to an end. "Vance?" I asked, my voice thin and wavering. "Who are these men? Did the moving company come back for the armoire?" I told Cassandra we didn't need the armoire. The lead man looked at me, then back at Vance. He gave a short, disgusted huff. "This is the major asset you are going to leverage, Vance? An old man who doesn't know what day it is?" "He's faking," Vance shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He was just talking to me. He's a lawyer. He's a ghost," the man interrupted. He stepped forward and grabbed Vance by the lapels of his silk robe, lifting him until the older man was on his tiptoes. "Silas wants his principal, Vance. Since there's no money in the safe, we're going to take a look at what else you've managed to acquire since you left Florida. I hear there's a garage full of designer luggage and a master suite full of fine china. No, that belongs to my daughter. Everything you touch belongs to Silas until the debt is settled," the man growled. He shoved Vance toward the stairs. The other two men followed, their footsteps heavy and rhythmic. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching them ascend into the main house. I knew what would happen next. They wouldn't hurt Cassandra or Julian. Silas was a professional, and violence was bad for business, but they would strip the house of every luxury item the Blackwoods had brought with them. They were about to learn that when you invite a shark into your pool, you shouldn't be surprised when he starts eating the patio furniture. I didn't follow them. Instead, I went to the safe, picked up the laminated card Vance had dropped, and tucked it into my pocket. I checked the recording on my phone. It was perfect. Clear audio, sharp video of Vance admitting to looking for bonds in my safe. It was the final nail in the coffin of his business consultant persona. 10 minutes later, the house above me erupted into a symphony of shattered glass and muffled screams. I heard Cassandra's voice, sharp, panicked, and entirely stripped of its southern charm as she realized the men in her living room weren't there to serve hors d'oeuvres. I heard Julian's voice, too, weak and pleading, the sound of a man who had spent his whole life letting others fight his battles and was finally facing a war he couldn't hide from. I sat on the pull-out sofa and waited. The chaos lasted for nearly an hour. The sound of my wife's china being packed into crates, the very china Eleanor had been so smug about, echoed through the vents. The designer rugs, the armoire, the silver, all of it was being hauled out the front door and into the black SUV. They were essentially being evicted by the very people Vance had tried to outrun. When the house finally went silent, I didn't go upstairs. I waited for the sound of the SUV pulling away, and then I waited another 30 minutes for the inevitable. The basement door flew open. Cassandra stood there, her hair disheveled, her expensive dress torn at the shoulder. Behind her, Julian looked like he'd been dragged through a hedge. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that looked like it might never leave them. "You did this," Cassandra hissed. She didn't whisper this time. She marched down the stairs, her heels clicking like gunshots on the concrete. "You left that door open. You called them, didn't you?" I looked up at her, my expression shifting from confused to exhausted. I didn't bother with the act anymore. The mask was off. "I'm a confused old man, Cassandra," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Remember? Dr. Harrison said I was having episodes. Maybe I just forgot how a deadbolt works. Or maybe I thought they were more decorators Eleanor hired to airy out the place. They took everything," she screamed. "My jewelry, the silver, my parents' car keys. They said if we called the police, they'd come back for Vance." "Well," I said, leaning back against the cinder block wall, "it sounds like you have a very difficult decision to make. Do you protect your father, or do you call the authorities and risk them finding out about his, quote, legal irregularities in Florida?" Julian stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Dad, they could have killed us. How could you let this happen? We're your family." "Family?" I asked, standing up. I was taller than my son, and in that moment, I felt the full weight of my 30 years in a courtroom. I stepped into his personal space, watching him flinch. Family doesn't move a man's life into the basement while he's out for a walk. Family doesn't plot to put their father in a memory care facility so they can sell his house to pay off a grifter's debts. You're not family, Julian. You're a liability I've finally decided to write off. Cassandra's eyes narrowed. She saw the change in me. The fading old man was gone, replaced by the litigator who had dismantled Fortune 500 CEOs without breaking a sweat. "You think you've won?" she whispered. "I have the power of attorney, Arthur. I have the deed transfer. I'm calling Heritage Grove tonight. They have an emergency transport team. By tomorrow morning, you'll be in a locked ward, and I'll have this house on the market before noon. I don't care about the silver. I care about the land." I felt a small, cold smile touch my lips. "You should check that power of attorney, Cassandra. I think you'll find the signature is problematic." "What are you talking about?" "I signed it, Arthur Sterling," I said. "But if you look closely at the flourishes, I included a very specific legal notation, a VC, next to the S. In the state of Alabama, that's a shorthand for vi coactus. It means under duress. Any notary worth their salt will see that and realize the document was signed under threat. And since I recorded the entire family meeting where you threatened to commit me if I didn't sign, well, the document isn't worth the paper Eleanor was using to line my trash cans." Cassandra's face went white. She lunged for the stairs, likely heading for the dining room to check the papers. Julian stayed where he was, looking at me as if he were seeing a stranger. "Dad," he started. "Go with her, Julian," I said. "Go help your wife realize that she's married a man who doesn't even know his own father's signature, and tell Vance that Silas knows where the secondary safe is. It's the one at the bank in Birmingham that I happen to have a lien against. I didn't tell him that there was no secondary safe. I just wanted them to spend the night in a state of absolute, bone-deep paranoia. I spent the rest of the night in my basement office, watching the security feed I'd secretly reinstalled via a wireless hub hidden in the laundry room. I watched Vance and Eleanor huddled in the living room, surrounded by the empty spaces where their prestige used to be. I watched Cassandra frantically pacing the master suite, clutching the power of attorney like a cursed object. But as the sun began to rise on Wednesday morning, I realized that I'd made one small mistake. I had underestimated just how desperate a cornered predator could be. Around 6 a.m., a white van with no markings pulled into the driveway. It didn't look like an ambulance. It looked like a transport vehicle for a high-security facility. 2 men in blue scrubs got out. They weren't carrying stethoscopes. They were carrying restraints. I watched on the monitor as Cassandra met them at the door. She wasn't crying anymore. She was composed, her face a mask of cold, professional grief. She pointed toward the basement door. "He's down there," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hidden mic. "He's become violent. He's been hallucinating all night, claiming people were stealing our things. Please, just get him to the Grove. We'll handle the paperwork later." I sat in the dark, my heart beginning to race. I had the recordings, I had the evidence, but none of that would matter if I was sedated and locked in a facility 2 hours away before I could get to a phone. I looked at the basement door. I heard the heavy thud of the orderly's boots on the stairs. I had 10 seconds. I reached for the burner phone, but my hand stopped. I looked at the laundry sink, then at the floor safe. A new idea, A dangerous final twist crystallized in my mind. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and waited. As the orderlies rounded the corner, I held up my hands, my face twisted into a look of absolute terrifying mania. "You're late!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. "The shadow people already took the silver. They're in the vents. They're coming for the boy." The orderlies paused, exchanged a look. They'd seen this before. They moved in, one from each side. "Easy now, Mr. Sterling," the larger one said. "We're just here to take you to a safe place." "Safe?" I laughed, a jagged, wild sound that echoed off the cinder blocks. "Nowhere is safe until the Blackwoods are in the ground. Julian, help me kill the shadow people." I felt the prick of a needle in my arm before I could say another word. The world began to tilt, the fluorescent lights turning into long, shimmering streaks of white. As they lifted me onto the gurney, I saw Cassandra standing at the top of the stairs, a look of pure, triumphant malice on her face. But as my eyes began to close, I felt the small, laminated card in my pocket, and I remembered that I hadn't just called the journalist and Silas. I had called the one person Cassandra was more afraid of than the law. The darkness claimed me, but as it did, I heard the faint, distant sound of a siren, and it wasn't coming from an ambulance. The world didn't come back all at once. It returned in jagged, sterile fragments, the hum of an industrial air conditioner, the faint scent of lemon-scented bleach, and a persistent, rhythmic tapping that sounded like a woodpecker on a metal pole. I tried to open my eyes, but they felt as if they had been glued shut with thick, salty residue. My arm throbbed where the needle had found its mark, a dull ache that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I was lying on a bed that was too firm to be a mattress and too soft to be a table. The sheets were crisp, cold, and smelled of high-pressure steam. As the fog in my brain began to lift, the memories of the basement, the orderlies, and Cassandra's triumphant face flooded back. I didn't panic. I'd spent 30 years waiting for juries to return verdicts. I knew how to sit with the weight of uncertainty. "He's coming around," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, low and clinical, devoid of any warmth. I forced my eyes open. The ceiling was a grid of acoustic tiles, one of which had a faint water stain shaped like a teardrop. I turned my head slowly. I was in a room that looked like a 5-star hotel suite designed by a prison architect. There was a velvet armchair, a mahogany dresser, and a large window overlooking a perfectly manicured lawn. But the glass was 3 layers thick and didn't have a latch. A woman in a navy blazer stood at the foot of the bed. She was holding a tablet, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Beside her was one of the orderlies from the house, the smaller one, who looked remarkably less like a medical professional and more like a nightclub bouncer in scrubs. "Welcome to Heritage Grove, Mr. Sterling," the woman said. "I'm Director Vane. You had quite a difficult evening. Your family was very concerned about your safety." I didn't answer immediately. I swallowed, my throat feeling like it had been scraped with sandpaper. "My family," I rasped, "has a very creative definition of concern." Director Vane offered a tight, rehearsed smile. "Agitation and paranoia are common during the initial transition. The sedative we administered was for your own protection. You were experiencing a significant manic episode, threatening your son and his wife." I sat up slowly, the world spinning for a brief second before settling into place. I reached into the pocket of my trousers. It was empty. The burner phone was gone. The laminated card from Silas was gone. My wallet, my keys, my identity, all of it had been stripped away during the intake process. I looked at the orderly, who was watching me with a bored, expectant expression. "You took my things," I said. "Standard procedure, Arthur," Vane replied. "We keep your personal items in a secure locker to prevent any accidents. Once you've been stabilized and Dr. Harrison completes his full assessment, we can discuss limited access." I looked at the window. The sun was high in the sky. It was Wednesday afternoon. The Florida firm was supposed to have arrived at my house 12 hours ago. If Silas had followed my instructions, the chaos at Crestline Drive was already in full swing, but I was trapped in a soundproof luxury bunker 2 hours away. "I'd like to speak to my attorney," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Of course," Vane said, though she didn't move. "In time. For now, the most important thing is rest. We've scheduled a light lunch for you in the solarium. It's a beautiful day, and the Montgomery family recently donated a stunning new fountain to the courtyard. I think you'll find the sound very soothing." The Montgomery family, Abigail Montgomery. The name acted like a shot of adrenaline to my system. Abigail was the sun around which the entire social galaxy of Mountain Brook orbited. She was 88 years old, possessed a tongue that could strip paint off a battleship, and happened to be my late wife, Sarah's godmother. Cassandra had spent the last 2 years trying to get into Abigail's good graces, hoping for an invitation to the Sapphire Gala, the only event that truly mattered in Alabama society. Cassandra didn't know that Abigail and I spoke every Tuesday afternoon, and she certainly didn't know that Abigail hated the Blackwoods with a passion that bordered on the biblical. I looked at Director Vane. "Tell me, Director, does Abigail Montgomery know that you're housing a man who was brought here under a forged power of attorney?" Vane's professional mask flickered for a millisecond. "The documents were notarized and signed by your son, Mr. Sterling. We are a private facility. We do not engage in family disputes." "Then you won't mind if I use the telephone," I said. I'm sure Abigail would love to hear how her goddaughter's husband was dragged out of his own home by men in scrubs while his son watched. "Mr. Sterling, you're confused," Vane said, but she took a step back. She signaled to the orderly, who moved closer to the bed. "Why don't you lie back down? We'll have the nurse bring you something to help with the anxiety." I realized then that I couldn't negotiate my way out of the room. The system was rigged. Cassandra had paid for a result, and Director Vane was going to deliver it. I had to wait. I had to trust that the seeds I'd planted before the needle hit my arm would grow without me. I spent the next 4 hours in a state of hyper-focused observation. I didn't fight. I didn't yell. I went to the solarium. I ate the tasteless chicken salad, and I watched the other residents. They were the ghosts of Mountain Brook, former judges, retired CEOs, and society matrons whose families had decided they were no longer on brand. They moved like clockwork, handled by staff with the same detached efficiency one might use to park an expensive car. I didn't know it yet, but the clock was already running out for the people at Crestline Drive. Back in Birmingham, the Wednesday I had orchestrated was unfolding like a masterpiece of litigation. At 4 p.m., while I was being encouraged to take a nap in the Grove, Miller, the journalist from the Alabama Inquirer, released the first part of his digital exposé. The headline was a masterpiece of local scandal: the fall of the Crestline Colonial, Florida grifters, forged deeds, and the elderly lawyer trapped in his own basement. Miller hadn't just used my lead. He had used the long-range photos he'd taken on Tuesday night. He had shots of the black SUV being loaded with my silver. He had shots of Vance Blackwood looking like a man about to be executed as he was shoved toward the back door. But most importantly, he had a copy of the security footage I'd uploaded to a cloud server the moment the orderlies entered the basement. The footage showed Cassandra and Julian discussing the power of attorney. It showed Cassandra admitting that the Florida firm was coming for Vance, and it showed me calm, articulate, and decidedly not manic being forcibly sedated while I was trying to explain the legal notation on the deed. By 5 p.m., the story was the most shared link in the state. By 6 p.m., the old money of Mountain Brook had seen it. Abigail Montgomery, sitting in her drawing room with a glass of sherry, had called the chief of police a man whose father she had put through college. At 7:30 p.m., the doors to my room at Heritage Grove didn't just open, they were practically kicked in. I was sitting in the velvet armchair, staring at the teardrop water stain, when Director Vane entered. She wasn't neutral anymore. Her face was the color of curdled milk, and she was clutching her tablet so hard, her knuckles were white. "Mr. Sterling," she stammered, there's been a misunderstanding. A massive clerical error regarding your intake." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in my trousers. I felt a surge of cold, sharp joy. "A clerical error, Director? Or a criminal one?" "The police are in the lobby," she whispered, "and Mrs. Montgomery is on the phone. She's threatening to have our licensing revoked by morning. We've recovered your personal items. Your car is waiting in the circular drive. One of our drivers will take you home immediately." "No," I said. "I'll take my own car, and I'll take the original intake file, all of it, including the copies of the forged documents my son provided." "Mr. Sterling, we can't." "You can and you will," I said, stepping toward her. I didn't look like a confused old man. I looked like the man who had once bankrupted an insurance company for denying a claim on a technicality, because if those documents aren't in my hand in 5 minutes, the next person walking through that door won't be a driver. It'll be a process server with a class action suit that will turn Heritage Grove into a parking lot. 5 minutes later, I was walking through the lobby. The orderlies wouldn't look at me. The receptionist kept her head down. I reached the front doors and stepped out into the humid Alabama night. My silver Lexus, the one Cassandra had moved to the street, was sitting under the porte-cochere, idling. I got behind the wheel, the smell of the leather upholstery grounding me. I looked at the passenger seat. There was a thick manila folder containing the evidence of my kidnapping, and on top of it was my burner phone. It was buzzing incessantly. I picked it up. 32 missed calls, a dozen texts. Most were from Julian, but the most recent one was from Silas. The Florida crew cleared the house. Vance and Eleanor are at a Motel 6 on the highway. Cassandra is still at the house, but the locks are being changed as we speak. Not by her, by the bank. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the drive. I didn't head for the Motel 6. I didn't care about Vance or Eleanor anymore. They were scavengers who had been picked clean by bigger predators. I headed for Crestline Drive. As I pulled into my neighborhood, the change was immediate. Usually, Crestline was a tomb of silence and privacy. Tonight, it was a circus. There were 2 police cruisers parked in front of my house, their blue and red lights painting the white brick in a rhythmic, violent strobe. A crowd of neighbors, the Sterling Harrisons, the Garretts, people who hadn't spoken to me in years, were standing on their lawns, their faces illuminated by the screens of their phones. I parked at the curb and walked up my driveway. Julian was sitting on the front steps, his head in his hands. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the bridge he'd been building was made of paper and the tide was coming in. Cassandra was standing by the front door, arguing with a tall man in a dark suit, a bank representative. A foreclosure notice was already taped to the Italian slate. "Arthur!" Cassandra shrieked when she saw me. She tried to run toward me, but a police officer stepped into her path, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Arthur, tell them! Tell them it's a mistake!" "Vance is gone. The men took everything. I stopped at the edge of the porch. I didn't look at her. I looked at my son. "Julian," I said. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Dad, I didn't know they'd actually take you to the Grove. I thought it was just a threat to make you listen." "You watched them put the needle in my arm, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden silence of the street. "You held the door open while they carried me out. You were the one who told them I was dangerous. She said it was the only way to save the estate," he cried, pointing at Cassandra. "She said you were going to lose everything to the creditors." "The creditors were here because of her father, Julian," I said. "They were here because you married into a family of thieves and then decided to steal from your own blood to cover their tracks." I turned to the bank representative. "Mr. Harrison, I presume, from First Alabama?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling. We received a notification of unauthorized asset transfer and a potential fraud claim regarding the deed. We've frozen the title pending a full investigation. As of now, the property is under a legal stay." "Excellent," I said. "I have the documentation right here proving the transfer was signed under duress, and I have the security footage of the transfer meeting." I handed him the manila folder from the Grove. I watched Cassandra's face as she realized that the VC notation wasn't just a clever trick, it was the trap that had just snapped shut on her neck. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go. "I'm your daughter-in-law. We're family." "No," I said, stepping past her to the front door. I pulled my real keys from my pocket, the ones Director Vane had returned with a trembling hand. "You're a squatter, and as of this moment, your permission to occupy these premises is revoked. You have 10 minutes to gather whatever the shadow people didn't take and leave. If you're still here at 11:15, I'll have the officers behind me arrest you for trespassing and filing a false police report." "And Julian?" she asked, her voice turning venomous as she looked at her husband. "What about your precious son?" I looked at Julian. He was standing now, looking at me with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Julian," I said, "you have 10 minutes too. Dad, please. I have nowhere to go. Everything I had was in Vanguard. It's all gone. You have the $542,000 I gave you over the last 4 years. I said, "Oh wait, you spent that on silk robes and green smoothies for people who were plotting to bury me. I guess you'll have to find a new break, Julian. But you won't find it here." I walked into my house and closed the door. The silence inside was profound. The house was empty, literally. The furniture was gone. The rugs were gone. The walls were bare. But as I stood in the foyer, looking at the spot where Sarah's favorite vase used to sit, I didn't feel the loss. I felt the space. I heard the muffled sounds of shouting from the porch, the sound of car doors slamming, and finally, the roar of an engine as Cassandra's car sped away. I walked down to the basement. I sat on the pull-out sofa, the only piece of furniture left in the entire house. I pulled out my phone and dialed Abigail Montgomery. "Arthur?" she answered. "Are you home?" "I am, Abigail," I said. "Good, because you have a gala to attend in 3 weeks, and I expect you to sit at my right hand. We need to show this town that the Sterlings don't just survive, we prevail." "I'll be there," I said. I hung up and looked at the dark cinder block walls. The revenge was almost complete. The Blackwoods were in a motel, Julian was on the street, and Cassandra's reputation in Mountain Brook was a smoldering ruin. But there was one final twist, one secret I hadn't shared with anyone, not even Silas. I reached under the pull-out sofa and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. It was Sarah's, the one Eleanor had tried to throw away. I opened it to the last page. Inside was a key to a safe deposit box in a bank in Birmingham. Not the one I'd told Vance about, a real one. And inside that box wasn't money. It was the life insurance policy Sarah had taken out on herself, with a rider I'd never noticed until after the funeral. A rider that paid out a double indemnity if her death was caused by medical negligence. I looked at the name of the doctor who had signed her death certificate 4 years ago, Dr. Sterling Harrison, the man who had just helped the Blackwoods try to commit me. I closed the journal and smiled into the darkness. The Blackwoods were the opening act. The real trial was about to begin. The silence of a house stripped of its contents is different from the silence of a house that is simply empty. In an empty house, there is a sense of potential, of waiting. In a house that has been plundered, the air feels wounded. I spent my first night back on Crestline Drive, sleeping on the floor of the master bedroom, wrapped in a wool-moving blanket I'd found in the garage. My back screamed, and the hardwood was unforgiving. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I didn't need a bed to know I was home. I just needed the weight of the deed in my pocket and the knowledge that the invaders were shivering in a roadside motel. I woke before the sun, my mind already functioning with the cold, rhythmic precision of a high-speed processor. I'd spent 35 years in insurance law, where cases weren't won in the courtroom, but in the months of tedious, grueling discovery that preceded it. I knew how to find the one loose thread that could unravel a billion-dollar company, and I had just found the thread that would hang Dr. Sterling Harrison and the Blackwoods together. I didn't bother with coffee. I drove to the local precinct at 6:30 a.m. to file a formal report for the theft of my property. I didn't want the silver back, it was just metal and memories, but I wanted a paper trail. I sat with a young officer named Garrett, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than taking a report from a 64-year-old man in a wrinkled suit. "You're saying your son and his wife orchestrated a theft by a third party?" Garrett asked, his pen hovering over the paper. "I'm saying my son allowed a man named Vance Blackwood to facilitate a collection in my home while I was being unlawfully detained," I said, my voice flat. "And I have the video evidence of the facilitation. I'll email the link to your captain. He and I go back quite a long way." The mention of the captain made the pen move much faster. By the time I left the station, I had a case number and a detective assigned to the misplaced assets. It was the first move in a much larger game. I wasn't just going for their money anymore, I was going for their freedom. I hadn't even begun to process the revelation in Sarah's journal, but I knew that if I rushed it, I'd lose my leverage. I headed to a small, greasy spoon diner on the edge of town called Miller's. It was the kind of place Cassandra wouldn't be caught dead in, which made it the perfect place to meet the ghost of my family. I'd sent Julian a text an hour earlier. "Miller's Diner, 8 a.m. Come alone or don't come at all." He was already there when I walked in, sitting in a back booth, hunched over a cup of black coffee. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was wearing the same shirt he'd had on the night before. He looked up as I slid into the booth opposite him, and for a second, I saw the boy who used to be afraid of the dark. "Dad," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what they were doing. I swear to you." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know, Julian," I said. "You wanted the easy way out. You wanted the big break without the work, and you let a woman like Cassandra convince you that your father was the obstacle to your success. She said you were losing it. She showed me medical reports, Dad. Harrison signed them. Harrison signed them because he's in debt to Vance Blackwood," I said, leaning forward. "And he's in debt to him for something much worse than a few bad investments. Tell me, Julian, what did Cassandra say about your mother's final weeks? About why Harrison was the only doctor allowed in the room?" Julian's face went from pale to ghostly. She said, She said you were too emotional to handle the details. That Harrison was doing us a favor by managing the palliative care. A favor, I repeated, the word tasting like ash. Julian, I'm going to give you one chance to save yourself. One. I need every document Cassandra ever showed you, every email from her father, every text where they talked about managing me. If you give me everything, I'll help you find a lawyer who might keep you out of a conspiracy charge. If you don't, you're going down with the ship. Dad, she's my wife. She's a predator who is currently deciding which of you to throw under the bus first, I said. Check your phone, Julian. Has she called you since she left the house? Has she asked where you're sleeping? Julian looked down at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. The silence told me everything I needed to know. Cassandra had already cut the dead weight. I have her old laptop, Julian said, his voice trembling. She left it in the guest room when she moved her stuff to the master suite. I think she forgot I had the password. Get it, I said, and get it to me by noon. I'll be at the house. I left him there, sobbing into his coffee, and drove to the one place I'd avoided for years, the Birmingham Medical Archives. I had my old partner credentials from the firm, and while I was retired, the staff there didn't need to know that. I spent the next 3 hours in a climate-controlled room, surrounded by the smell of old paper and the ghosts of thousands of medical tragedies. I found Sarah's file. It was thick, filled with the charts of a woman who should have survived a routine surgery. I flipped through the pages, my heart hammering against my ribs, until I found the surgical log from 4 years ago. There it was, a discrepancy so small most people would have missed it. The anesthesia levels were recorded in 2 different inks, and the nurse who had initialed the final dosage wasn't on the hospital's roster for that month. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. Harrison hadn't just been negligent, he'd been covering for something. I cross-referenced the date with a name I'd seen in Sarah's journal, the Blackwood Harrison venture. It wasn't a business deal, it was a clinical trial, an unauthorized offshore pharmaceutical test that Vance Blackwood had been laundering through Harrison's private practice. Sarah hadn't died from a routine complication. She'd been an unwitting test subject for a drug that had never been cleared by the FDA. I sat back in the metal chair, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They hadn't just tried to take my house. They had taken the woman I loved to fund their lifestyle. The rage I'd been suppressing for months didn't explode. It calcified. It became a sharp, unbreakable tool. I drove home, the neighborhood of Mountain Brook looking like a hollow stage set. I pulled into the driveway and saw a white Mercedes parked at the curb, not Cassandra's. It was Dr. Sterling Harrison's. He was standing on my porch, looking polished and professional in a charcoal suit, though he was tapping his foot with an agitated rhythm. He looked up as I got out of the car, his face shifting into a look of practiced, oily concern. "Arthur," he said, stepping down to meet me. "I heard about the incident last night. I came as soon as I could. Director Vane told me there was a legal misunderstanding, but I'm worried about your blood pressure. We really should get you back to the clinic for a proper observation." I didn't stop walking. I brushed past him and unlocked the front door, stepping into the cavernous, empty foyer. I turned to face him, the medical file tucked under my arm like a weapon. "You're a bold man, Sterling," I said, using his first name with a sneer. "Walking onto the property of a man you kidnapped less than 24 hours ago. I assume Vance told you the Florida firm found him? That the money you were promised from my estate isn't coming?" Harrison's face stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm here as your physician." "You're here because you're terrified," I said. I threw the medical file onto the floor between us. It skittered across the slate, the pages fanning out like a deck of cards. "I found the anesthesia logs, Harrison. I found the venture notes Sarah kept in her journal. I know about the trial. I know my wife was a data point for you and Vance." The change in Harrison was instantaneous. The polished doctor evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked like he was standing on a trapdoor. He looked at the file, then back at me, his eyes darting toward the door. "Arthur, you're misinterpreting the data. Clinical trials are complex. Sarah had a pre-existing condition. Sarah was healthy until she walked into your operating room," I said. "What did Vance promise you? A partnership in a Caribbean clinic? A way out of the malpractice suits that were piling up in Florida? Whatever it wasn't worth what's about to happen to you. You have no proof," he hissed, the good doctor facade finally shattering. "That file is old news. The hospital board signed off on everything. You're just a grieving old man who wants someone to blame." "I'm not just a grieving old man," I said. stepping closer until I could smell the expensive peppermint on his breath. "I'm the man who recorded you and Vance in the basement last night. I'm the man who has a witness, my son, who is currently handing over his wife's laptop to the authorities. And I'm the man who just spent 3 hours with the medical examiner's office requesting an exhumation and a secondary toxicology report." Harrison backed away, his hand fumbling for the doorknob. "You're insane. You'll never get an exhumation order." "I don't need one," I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "Abigail Montgomery sits on the board of the hospital. She's already called the DA. By this time tomorrow, your medical license won't be worth the frame it's in." "And Vance?" "Vance is currently being questioned by the detectives I sent to his motel. I wonder how long a man like him will hold out before he tells them everything about your venture." Harrison didn't say another word. He turned and practically ran for his car, the tires screeching as he sped away from Crestline Drive. I stood in the doorway, watching him go. I felt a strange sense of peace. The house was empty, my family was shattered, and the woman I loved was gone. But for the first time in 4 years, the truth was out in the open air. I walked back to the kitchen and saw Julian standing at the back door. He was holding a slim, silver laptop. He looked at the medical file on the floor, then at me. "I have it, Dad," he said. The password was Sterling Legacy. She really thought she was going to own this town. "She was wrong," I said, taking the laptop. "What happened next changed the course of everyone's life, Julian, but mostly yours. You need to decide right now. Are you a Sterling, or are you a footnote in a Blackwood tragedy?" Julian looked at the empty house, then at me. "I'm your son, Dad. Tell me what to do." I looked at the laptop, then at the case number on my kitchen counter. "First," I said, "we're going to call the journalist. We have a second headline for him. And then we're going to wait for the knock on the door." "Who's coming?" Julian asked. "The police," I said. "But they aren't coming for us. They're coming for the people who thought they could bury a man in his own basement." But as I opened the laptop, I saw a folder on the desktop that hadn't been there before. It was titled The Exit Strategy. I clicked on it, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't just a plan for the house. It was a plan for a life insurance policy I didn't know I had. A policy that paid out $5 million upon my accidental death while in the care of a licensed medical facility. Cassandra hadn't just wanted the house. She'd wanted me dead. And the date for the accident was scheduled for tonight at Heritage Grove. I looked at the clock. It was 4:30 p.m. "Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "call the detective. Tell him to meet us at the Motel 6. Now." "Why?" "Because Cassandra isn't waiting for the law to catch up with her," I said. "She's going to finish what she started. And if we don't get to Vance before she does, the only witness we have left is going to disappear." The drive to the outskirts of Birmingham was a blur of neon signs and the thick, suffocating heat of an Alabama evening. Julian drove my Lexus with a frantic, white-knuckled grip while I sat in the passenger seat, the silver laptop open on my lap. The exit strategy folder was a digital roadmap of a murder. Cassandra hadn't just been thorough, she'd been arrogant. She'd saved the login credentials for the offshore insurance portal, the encrypted messages to the transport team, and even a PDF of the falsified medical history Harrison had been building for me over the last 6 months. "He's at the Gateway Inn, Dad. Room 114, Julian said, his voice cracking. "I see her car, the white Mercedes." I looked out the window. The motel was a depressing stretch of stucco and peeling paint, illuminated by a flickering sign that buzzed like a dying insect. Cassandra's car was parked crookedly near the back of the lot, away from the streetlights. She wasn't hiding. She was in a hurry. "Stay in the car, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the air conditioning. "Call Detective Miller. Tell him we are on site, and there is an immediate threat to a witness. Do not come inside until you see the blue lights. Dad, you can't go in there alone. She's dangerous." "I've spent 30 years dealing with people who think they're dangerous, Julian," I said, opening the door. "Most of them are just loud. Cassandra is about to find out what happens when you stop being loud and start being an evidence file." I walked across the cracked asphalt, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. I reached room 114 and pressed my ear to the door. The wood was thin, the kind that didn't keep secrets. Inside, the voices were sharp and jagged. "You're going to sign the waiver, Vance," Cassandra hissed. "If you don't, the Florida people will be the least of your worries. I'll tell the police you were the one who altered the anesthesia logs. I'll make sure Harrison points the finger directly at you." "I can't." Vance's voice was a pathetic, broken sob. They already know, Cassandra. Arthur found the logs. It's over. It's only over if Arthur stays alive long enough to testify, she screamed. The transport team is on their way here now. We're going to tell them there's been a change of plans. An accidental overdose in a motel room is much easier to explain than a death at a luxury facility. We'll say you and Eleanor were distraught, and Arthur came here to end it all together. My hand gripped the doorknob. It was unlocked. I didn't burst in. I walked in, silent and steady, like a man entering a boardroom. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. Vance was huddled on a stained floral bedspread, his silk robe now tattered and gray. Eleanor was in the corner, clutching a plastic bag of pill bottles as if it were a holy relic. Cassandra stood in the center of the room, her designer blouse stained with sweat, holding a fountain pen like a dagger. She froze when she saw me. The triumph I'd seen on her face at the basement stairs was gone, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "Arthur," she breathed. How are you here?" The clerical error at Heritage Grove was more of a structural collapse. "Cassandra," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "It turns out Abigail Montgomery doesn't like it when people kidnap her family. And Silas? Silas doesn't like it when people use his name to leverage life insurance policies." I held up the laptop. "I've seen the exit strategy. The $5 million. The accidental death scheduled for tonight. It was a beautiful plan. Truly. In the world of insurance litigation, we call this premeditated fraud with a side of first-degree murder." "You have nothing," she snapped, though her eyes were darting toward the window. "That laptop, you stole it." "Actually, Julian gave it to me," I said. "He's in the car right now, talking to the district attorney. He's telling them how you used his grief over his mother to fund your father's gambling debts. He's telling them how you and Harrison turned my wife into a lab rat." Vance let out a low, keening wail and buried his face in his hands. Cassandra looked at her father with a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You coward," she spat at Vance. "You ruined everything. If you hadn't botched the Florida job, we wouldn't even be in this godforsaken state." "The Florida job didn't ruin you, Cassandra," I said. "Your ego did. You thought an old man was an easy target because he was quiet. You forgot that quiet people spend a lot of time listening. And I've been listening to you for 2 years." The sound of sirens began to swell in the distance, the rhythmic rising wail of the Birmingham PD. Cassandra lunged for the door, but I stepped into her path. I didn't have to touch her. I just had to stand there, a 64-year-old man who had finally found his spine. "The police are here for Vance and Eleanor," I said. "But the detectives from the Major Crimes Unit? They're here for you and Harrison. They found the doctor at the airport, by the way. He had a one-way ticket to Grand Cayman and a suitcase full of Sarah's jewelry that Eleanor thought she'd donated." Eleanor shrieked, dropping the bag of pills. The bottles scattered across the carpet like plastic hail. The door was kicked open a moment later. Detective Miller led the way, his weapon drawn but lowered as he saw the scene. Julian followed him, his face a mask of shame and resolve. He didn't look at Cassandra as the officers moved in to cuff Vance and Eleanor. He only looked at me. "Arthur Sterling," Miller said, nodding to me. "We've got Harrison in custody. He's already talking. Apparently, he's not interested in going to prison for a Blackwood." I watched as they led Cassandra away. She didn't go quietly. She screamed insults. She fought the cuffs. She turned into the very thing she'd tried to paint me as, a manic, violent person who had lost touch with reality. As they put her in the back of the cruiser, she looked at the Gateway Inn, this grimy, low-rent purgatory, and I knew she realized this was the last estate she would ever see. 6 months later, the humidity of Mountain Brook was just as thick, but the air on Crestline Drive felt lighter. The house was no longer a hollow shell. I'd spent the last few months meticulously restoring it, not to the way it was when the Blackwoods were there, but to the way it was when Sarah was alive. I'd tracked down the Persian rug, the silver, and even the Tiffany lamp. It cost a fortune in legal fees and private investigators, but every piece returned felt like a victory over the darkness. Julian lived in a small apartment downtown now. He was working as a junior clerk at a rival law firm, starting from the bottom, earning every cent. We didn't talk every day, but we talked. He was in therapy, trying to untangle the years of manipulation Cassandra had woven into his life. He wasn't the man I'd hoped he would be yet, but he was no longer the man who had stayed silent at the breakfast table. I stood in the sunroom, the morning light pouring over the new hardwood floors. There was no yoga equipment here. Just my desk, my books, and a single framed photo of Sarah on our honeymoon in Amalfi. The glass was new, but the smile was the same. Vance and Eleanor were serving time for fraud and larceny in Florida. Dr. Sterling Harrison had lost his license and was facing 15 years for his role in the unauthorized clinical trials and the subsequent cover-up of Sarah's death. And Cassandra was in a state correctional facility facing charges of attempted murder and insurance fraud. I heard through Abigail Montgomery that she was trying to organize a fashion committee in the prison yard. Some people never change, they just find new audiences for their grift. I sat in my wingback chair, the one Vance had tried to claim, and picked up my coffee. It was exactly 72 degrees in the house. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the quiet dignity of a life reclaimed. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Abigail. "The Sapphire Gala is tonight, Arthur. My car will be there at 7. Don't be late. We have a front row to maintain." I smiled. I looked around my house, my white brick fortress, my ivy-covered sanctuary. I hadn't just saved my property. I had saved my mind. And as I looked at the VC notation on the framed deed hanging on the wall, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the arrests or the money. The greatest revenge was living a life they couldn't touch. I stood up, adjusted my tie in the mirror, and walked toward the front door. I checked the deadbolt. It was locked, solid, secure. I stepped out onto the porch, the Alabama sun warming my face. I wasn't a ghost in this house anymore. I was the master of it. And as I walked down the Italian slate steps toward the street, I didn't look back. There was no need. The past was in the files, and the future was wide open. In the world of insurance, we always plan for the worst-case scenario. But as I looked at the clear blue sky over Mountain Brook, I realized I'd finally found the one thing you can't put a policy on: peace.